Let me tell you something that the education system never told you. The thing it measured you on, the grades, the test scores, the IQ adjacent assessments that sorted you into categories and told you what kind of future you were likely to have, is not the primary predictor of how well your life goes. Not professionally, not relationally, not in terms of the things that most people, when they are honest with themselves, actually care about most. The research is unambiguous on this, and it has been unambiguous for decades. Yet somehow the system that was supposed to prepare you for life kept measuring the wrong thing. In 1995, Daniel Goleman published a book that synthesized a body of research that had been building in the academic psychology literature for years. And the central claim of that book, that emotional intelligence is a better predictor of life outcomes than IQ, was controversial enough when it was published that it generated significant academic debate. 30 years of subsequent research has largely settled that debate, not by dismissing IQ. Cognitive ability is real. It matters. In specific domains and specific contexts, it is the most important variable available. But in the domains that most people actually inhabit, the relational, the professional, the personal, the research keeps arriving at the same conclusion. The person who can understand and manage their own emotional states, who can read and respond to the emotional states of others, who can navigate the emotional complexity of human relationships and organizations with skill and awareness. That person has an advantage that no IQ score can replicate. And, unlike IQ, emotional intelligence can be developed. That is the story the research is telling. And it starts much earlier than most people think. Let's start with what emotional intelligence actually is, because the popular understanding of it has drifted significantly from what the research actually measures. Peter Salovey and John Mayer, the psychologists who first formally defined and operationalized emotional intelligence in the academic literature in 1990, before Goleman popularized the concept, identified 4 distinct and hierarchically organized abilities. The first is the ability to accurately perceive emotions in your own face, in your own body, in the faces and voices and bodies of other people. This is the foundational ability. The capacity to accurately read the emotional signal that is being produced rather than the emotional signal you expected or wanted to find. The second is the ability to use emotions to facilitate thought. The recognition that emotional states are not just noise interfering with rational decision-making, but information, sometimes the most important information available, that can be deliberately recruited to support the kind of thinking the current situation requires. The third is the ability to understand emotions, to know how emotional states develop, how they change, how they interact with each other. How the expression of one emotion in a relationship affects the emotional state of the other person. The cognitive map of the emotional world. The fourth, and the highest in the model, is the ability to manage emotions, both your own and those of others. Not suppression, not denial. The active, skilled, deliberate regulation of emotional states in ways that serve the goals and the well-being of everyone involved. These 4 abilities are distinct. They develop through different mechanisms. They predict different outcomes. And, unlike the one-dimensional IQ construct, they represent a genuine model of the complexity of what emotional skill actually requires. Here is the finding that I think is most important for understanding why emotional intelligence predicts success so powerfully. It predicts success specifically in the domains where success requires other people, and most success requires other people. Research by Sigal Barsade at the Wharton School of Business on emotional contagion in organizational settings, and the broader literature on leadership effectiveness and emotional intelligence consistently finds that the single variable most predictive of effective leadership is not IQ. It is not domain expertise. It is not even conscientiousness, though that matters considerably. It is the leader's ability to manage their own emotional state in ways that produce a positive emotional environment for the people around them. To be, as we discussed in the leadership script, a thermostat rather than a thermometer. To regulate the temperature of the room rather than simply reflecting it. Elaine Hatfield's research on emotional contagion, the unconscious transmission of emotional states between people, provides the neurological mechanism. The emotional state of the most influential person in a group spreads to the rest of it through automatic mimicry. Through the mirror neuron system, through processes that the group members are not consciously aware of and cannot consciously resist. The leader with high emotional intelligence manages their own emotional state, not just for their own well-being. They do it because their emotional state is being continuously broadcast to everyone around them and absorbed into the group's collective emotional environment. The composure of the emotionally intelligent leader is not just personal regulation, it is a form of environmental management. Let me talk about the research on emotional intelligence and relationships, because this is where the predictive power of EQ is most personally significant for most people. John Gottman's longitudinal research on marital stability and divorce prediction, one of the most extensive and methodologically rigorous bodies of relationship research ever conducted, identified with remarkable accuracy the patterns that predict whether relationships survive. And what Gottman found is, at its core, a story about emotional intelligence. The couples whose relationships deteriorated and eventually ended were not primarily the couples who argued more. They were the couples where the partners had the least capacity to regulate their emotional states during conflict, where contempt, the specific emotional expression of viewing a partner as beneath consideration, was present, where the emotional bids for connection that partners made were consistently missed or rejected, where the emotional flooding that intense conflict produces was managed through withdrawal rather than through the genuine repair that emotional intelligence supports. The couples whose relationships thrived were not the couples who never fought. They were the couples who could fight and repair, who could be dysregulated by conflict and return to connection, who could make and receive the emotional bids that Gottman identified as the basic currency of relational maintenance. That is, emotional intelligence in its most practical and most consequential expression. And the research on its predictive power in relationships is as strong as the research on its predictive power in professional contexts. Now let me address something directly, because the academic debate around emotional intelligence has produced genuine criticisms that deserve honest treatment rather than dismissal. The most significant criticism, made most forcefully by psychologists like Edwin Locke, is that emotional intelligence, as popularly conceived, is not a distinct form of intelligence at all. That it is better understood as a combination of personality traits, particularly agreeableness and emotional stability, that are already well measured by existing personality frameworks and that do not require a separate intelligence construct. This is a legitimate point, and the research has responded to it in ways that have refined rather than demolished the framework. The distinction that the subsequent research has clarified is between ability-based emotional intelligence, the Mayer-Salovey model of specific measurable skills, and trait-based emotional intelligence, the self-reported tendency to perceive and manage emotions effectively. The ability-based model holds up better under the scrutiny of the academic criticism. It measures specific, testable skills. It produces outcomes that are not fully explained by personality traits or by IQ. It predicts incremental variance in performance and well-being over and above what existing measures capture. The trait-based model, which is what most popular emotional intelligence assessments measure, is more vulnerable to the criticism that it is measuring known personality constructs with a new label. The honest version of the emotional intelligence research is not that EQ renders IQ irrelevant. It is that the ability to perceive, use, understand, and manage emotion is a specific and measurable set of skills that predicts outcomes that IQ does not fully explain, and that developing those skills, through deliberate attention, through genuine feedback, through the specific practices that the research identifies as developmentally effective, produces real and measurable improvements in the outcomes that most people care about most. Here is the developmental research, because this is the piece that makes the emotional intelligence framework most practically valuable. Unlike IQ, which the research treats as largely stable across the lifespan after early development, emotional intelligence is substantially developmental. It is built through experience, through relationships, through the specific practice of paying attention to emotional information and learning to work with it skillfully. The research on how emotional intelligence develops identifies early caregiving as the foundational influence. Alan Shore's work on the development of emotional regulation and the attachment research we discussed in the childhood parenting script documents how the capacity to understand and manage emotional states is built through the early experience of co-regulation with an attuned caregiver. The child whose emotional states are consistently responded to, named, and helped to regulate by a caregiver who demonstrates in thousands of small interactions across the early years of life that emotions are manageable, that distress passes, that connection is reliably available, is a child whose emotional intelligence architecture is being built on a solid foundation. But the developmental research is also clear that emotional intelligence continues to be built across the lifespan. Through reflective practice, through genuine relationships that provide accurate feedback on how your emotional expressions are received, through the specific experience of emotional difficulty navigated and learned from rather than simply endured, and critically, through deliberate attention to the emotional information that most people have been trained to ignore, through the practice of treating emotions as data rather than as noise. Here is the piece that the research identifies as the most practically actionable component of emotional intelligence development. What researchers call emotional granularity, the precision with which you can identify and name your own emotional states. Lisa Feldman Barrett's research on emotional granularity found that the capacity to distinguish between specific emotional states, to know not just that you are upset, but whether you are angry or hurt or afraid or ashamed or some specific combination of these, is one of the most consequential skills in the entire emotional intelligence framework. Because the regulatory response that works for anger is different from the regulatory response that works for hurt. The interpersonal communication that a state of fear requires is different from what shame requires. The decision-making that serves you well when you are genuinely excited is different from the decision-making that serves you well when you are anxiously activated. The person who cannot distinguish between their emotional states responds to all of them with the same undifferentiated response, which works sometimes and fails often. The person who can identify specifically what they are feeling, who has the vocabulary and the self-awareness to name the precise texture of their emotional state, can choose the response that actually fits, can communicate what they are experiencing accurately, can seek the support or take the action that the specific state actually requires. Barrett's research found that emotional granularity was associated with better physical health, better mental health, better interpersonal functioning, and better performance across multiple life domains. Not through any complex intervention, through the specific practice of paying more precise attention to what you are actually feeling and developing the vocabulary to name it. Here is where I want to land. The research on emotional intelligence is not a story about soft skills that complement the real hard skills. It is a story about a set of capabilities that the measurement systems we use to evaluate human potential consistently undervalue, and that the outcomes of actual human lives consistently demonstrate are among the most important determinants of how well things go. The ability to perceive emotional information accurately, to use it to think more effectively, to understand how emotions develop and interact in yourself and in others, to manage emotional states, yours and the ones you are generating in the people around you, with skill rather than with suppression or expression without regulation. These are not traits you either have or do not have. They are skills, developed through attention, through practice, through the genuine feedback of relationships and experience that the emotionally intelligent person treats as information rather than as noise. And the research on the outcomes they produce is consistent across every domain where human beings have to work with other human beings, which is most of the domains that matter most. IQ opens doors. It predicts performance in environments designed to reward the specific cognitive abilities it measures. Emotional intelligence determines what happens once you are through the door, in the relationships, in the organizations, in the thousands of human interactions that make up the actual texture of a life. The research says it matters more, not instead of intelligence, in addition to it, and in the domains where it counts the most, more reliably, more consistently, and across more of the things that actually matter than almost anything else the psychology of human performance has ever measured.